I'm sure as I look out at the crowd today, at one time or another, all of you have dropped a glass or a plate or a bowl onto the floor only to watch it shatter. It happened to me once again a few weeks back. I was unloading the dishwasher and I pulled a mug out, a porcelain mug, and as I turned around to put it up into the cabinet, it slipped out of my hand and hit the tile floor, and pieces went everywhere. Shards were there around me as I stood there in my bare feet. I could see them. They were over towards the laundry room, and some were even in the family room. Now I had to gingerly tiptoe around to not step on it and get it cleaned up. As I paint that picture for you, I would then present a metaphor that happens in families. That all it takes is a harsh word, a moment of anger, a disagreement. And in that place, it's like dropping a porcelain mug on the floor and watching it shatter. And the recipients of that anger, of that volatility, are the individuals that are now tiptoeing around the house, trying to avoid stepping on those shards. The fact of the matter is that's true for every household. Doesn't matter if you were raised in a Christian home, if your parents love the Lord, if they brought you to the church. The reason is that all of us are sinners, and all of us come here today with wounds and injuries. So the Apostle Paul, when he reaches chapter 5, gives Timothy some practical instructions about the home and about the church, that he's helping us to see that we can be different in our generation, that we can avoid those kinds of injuries. But not only that with God's help, we can experience healing from the past and the wounds that's taken place. And whether that's in your biological home or it's in your church home, it's a transcendent idea, and it's a principle that Paul wants Timothy, the pastor of Ephesus, to understand and to teach, and clearly for us to understand. We're going to be studying verses 1 through 8, and I want to read all 8 verses. As I read, I want you to notice the groups that he is addressing. And then as we understand that, we'll begin to see how it affects us. At Cornerstone, we like to honor the Lord. And one of the ways we do that is to stand. If you are able and willing, would you do so? And follow along as I read 1 Timothy 5, beginning in verse 1. Paul wrote, "Do not rebuke an older man harshly, but exhort him as if he were your father. Treat younger men as brothers, older women as mothers, and younger women as sisters with absolute purity. Give proper recognition to those widows who are really in need. But if a widow has children or grandchildren, these should learn first of all to put their religion into practice by caring for their own family, and so repaying their parents and grandparents, for this is pleasing to God. The widow who is really in need and left all alone puts her hope in God and continues night and day to pray and to ask God for help. But the widow who lives for pleasure is dead even while she lives. Give the people these instructions so that no one may be open to blame. Anyone who does not provide for their relatives, and especially for their own household, has denied the faith and is worse than an unbeliever." Thank you. You may be seated. When you go back to my introduction, you may be thinking that it's presumptuous that I would attach healing and restoration to these verses. But I want to invite you into a larger context related to 1 Timothy. If we go back to Ephesians, that Paul wrote to that group of people, the same group that Timothy is now ministering to, we're reminded in chapter 4 that one of his exhortations were to fathers and dads, and he said, "Do not exasperate your children lest they become discouraged." It's safe to assume that when he gave that exhortation, more than likely there were dads or fathers that had failed to do that. They were overbearing. They were hurtful. Their expectations were not realistic. Paul said, don't let that be the case with you, dads. He also told the wives that they're to respect their husbands and submit to their authority. More than likely, there were some that were bitter, that they were sarcastic, that they didn't honor their husbands, they didn't respect them. And then, of course, he went on to say to the husbands that you're to love your wives as Christ loved the church and gave his life for it. As we hear him say that, we can be confident that there were husbands that were failing to do that. They weren't putting their wives first. They weren't acting as servants. They were not giving their lives up for them. In fact, they were selfish and self-centered. And so Paul gives these exhortations, and he says the church family should be different. And he makes a statement knowing that there's wounds and injuries that have happened within families and within churches. We can also draw the conclusion that all of us are sinners, as I stated earlier. All of us were born into sin, which means there's sin in each family, which also assumes that there's injuries and hurts. And I would argue, based upon the gospel, that Jesus Christ declared that he came to bring life that is abundant, that he is a God that reconciles, that redeems. And he wants to redeem families, and he wants to redeem relationships, and he wants to redeem churches. And so here is practical advice for us today of how does he recommend that happen. I want you to write down the first thing that we're going to witness is that we are made whole by offering respect. When we stop and consider what respect actually looks like in given relationships and we begin to exercise that, people begin to feel honored and healing begins to take place. Let me take you back to verse 1. Paul began this chapter by telling Timothy, the pastor, do not rebuke an older man harshly, but exhort him as if he were your father. In the first century, not just in the church, the Mediterranean culture, there was an expected honor that was given to all elders, women and men. And in fact, in many occasions, they would treat them as if they were their own mothers and fathers. So this was not a foreign idea to Timothy. Paul gives this instruction because Timothy would have had older men on his elder board. There would have been individuals serving in his church. We've already established that he was probably 29, maybe 35 years of age, his first senior pastor gig. And ministering to people that are 30, 40 years older than himself, it had to be challenging because more than likely some would look down on him. We saw that in the passage last week and basically check him off because he didn't have the experience. It's quite possible that he dealt with that by being authoritative, using his title. I'm in charge. I'm the senior pastor. The Apostle Paul put me here. But Paul cautions him and he says, treat each of these men with respect and honor and realize and recognize their experience. Let's keep going. Pick up in the second sentence of verse 1. He's going to talk about some other groups in the church. He begins by saying, treat younger men as brothers, older women as mothers, and younger women as sisters with absolute purity. In the same vein, there would have been individuals that were his age and maybe younger in the church. And I've witnessed before where individuals that are younger and are given a certain title and authority, how easy it is to look at their peers and be condescending, to check them off. And Paul says, don't make that mistake, Timothy. When you look at these younger men, think about them as your brothers. Understand their weaknesses. Be sympathetic with their plight. And then he talks about the mothers, the older women. As we've already referenced, looking at older men as fathers, he's saying the same thing. Look at older women as mothers. Consider them, this maternal instinct, this respect that is due them. And he finishes by talking about the young women. Timothy being a bachelor, eligible bachelor, it wasn't just the fact that he needed to treat them as sisters in community, but he makes the mention with purity. So I look at my young friends that are here and I think about your own situations. There's about college age and post-college age at our church, over 100 faithful attenders. And for those that are in that group, it can be a bit precarious. There's that chemistry sometimes. And how do we look at each other and how do we approach each other? Is that person like me? Should I ask them out? And we lead with all of these questions. And what Paul is exhorting that group to do is don't make that mistake. Begin by looking at each other with respect and honor as if they were your brother or your sister, and show great value of the fact that you're a part of God's family. As Paul is helping Timothy to have this comprehension, this understanding, one of the themes that's running through this is humility. I want to make this assertion. Humility is foundational for the familiar honor. If you want to have honor in your immediate family and you want to have honor in your church, it begins by putting on humility, clothing yourself with humility. As Paul would say to the Philippians, thinking not only your own interests, but also for the interest of others. And he says, when that begins to happen, and we begin to see that we truly are the family of God, we begin to heal of the wounds that came from insensitivity, from being neglected, from being overlooked. So how do we live this out? How does this become a part of our community? How does it increase? Let me lead with an illustration. I was here on a Friday a few weeks back, and I was leaving afternoon to run to an appointment, and I couldn't find my phone. I went through my briefcase, it wasn't there. I went through my desk, didn't see it there. All through the office, hadn't set it down any place. Went back to my car twice, assuming that I had left it in my car. Wasn't there. The only other person at that time that was here was Pastor Mike Churchill. So I went over to Mike's office. I said, Mike, I can't find my phone anywhere. Would you try calling my phone, see if I can hear it? So we stepped out of his office. He made the phone call, couldn't hear it. He made this offer. He said, how about I go with you? We'll retrace your steps, and perhaps some fresh eyes will help you to see it. I said, well, if you insist, but I don't think it's going to help. I've covered all of my tracks. His recommendation was, well, let's start with your car. My car was here in the parking lot. We walked out to it. I went to unlock the car and open the door. And before I could get the door open, he says, it's right there. I said, what do you mean it's right there? He says, look through the front of your car, through the windshield. It's sitting on your dashboard in that corner. He was right. I needed a fresh pair of eyes. And I would argue when it comes to honoring those around us, we need a fresh pair of eyes. We need to look at each other differently. So I want to provide some suggestions of how we can do this. One other contextual comment. Pastor Mike Medeiros last week helped us to understand that in this culture, first century, anybody that was over 40 was considered old. I apologize though they had just reached 40, but the fact of the matter is that you're old. And he said anybody under 40 is young. So if you're just turning 30, congratulations, you're still young. So there's the categories as I describe what we need to do. Here's the first thing that comes. Respect older adults by acknowledging their presence and by then accessing their knowledge, by acknowledging their presence. What I've discovered as people age, they become invisible to the culture around them. Our culture adores youthfulness. I would even argue they worship youthfulness. I'll give you just one example. There's an ad agency back east called 449. And they've talked about the fact that from 18 to 34 is the desirable demographic. That is the demographic that they target because they're the ones that are spending money. They oftentimes will do it impulsively. They have new cash as they finish school. They're excited about having new gadgets. And for all of you that have reached 35 and older, you've actually settled down according to the market. You're not as exciting to them. Now, as I give you that example, that is not confined to advertising. I would say it even happens in the church. And typically, it's not when you're 40s or even your 50s, but by the time you reach 60, what begins to happen is that many begin to look at you as being obsolete. You're not seen, you're not valued, you're not appreciated. So I want to encourage you, especially if you have loved ones that are in that age category, but here in the church, is that I want you to take the time to actually acknowledge them. Let me get specific. The majority of you attend the 9:30 service. And as I watch, you tend to sit in the exact same places. And when we have the greeting time of our worship, you begin to get acquainted with the people around you. You may have actually learned their names. I want you to go a step further. Let's say you have children and you need to go pick your kids up. I want to encourage you to, after you've introduced yourself during greeting time, to say, I would love to get to know you better. I have to run and get my kids, but maybe we can grab coffee or go to the park or spend some time hanging out. And coming back to this idea of accessing, you can spend time with them and have amazing insight and knowledge. Let me give you a few questions that's going to benefit you. Let's say they're married. If you get a chance to have coffee with one of them, ask them how they met. Inquire how they got engaged. Discover what the challenges have been in their marriage, the difficulty in raising children. It's possibly that they've lost a parent by this time. I hate to say this, but the fact is that if you're here today and you're in your 20s and 30s, there is going to come a time where you're going to lose a parent. To spend time with someone who's already walked through that and understands what that loss feels like is going to be a great advantage and blessing to you. If you come every Sunday and you participate in the music of the worship and you have some greeting time together and you're in the Word and you leave and you don't make a deeper connection, you have wasted the most amazing opportunity of community. Because I'm telling you, in this group of people, acknowledging that I'm biased, in this group of people are some of the most godly, wise, and caring people you can ever meet. But you have to take the initiative. You have to access that wisdom and that knowledge through shared stories. Now, for my younger friends, I want to speak about your situation, and I want to talk especially to my peers. As it comes on the screen, I want you to know, to respect younger adults, you must appreciate their plight and affirm their contributions. Appreciate their plight and confirm their contributions. I want to especially, as I've said, talk to my peers. There are times where I have heard those in my age group speak down about the younger generation. I hear comments like, when I was their age, I was working 2 jobs, paying a mortgage, and raising my family. And the response that I want to give to my peers, and our parents said the same thing to us. My mom and dad were part of World War II, the Depression era. My dad literally had to bring wood into their household for the stove. There was no indoor plumbing. They had to go outside for the bathroom or to pump water. And I'd hear my parents and their friends saying the same thing to us. Well, when I was your age, I literally brought wood in for the fire. Everything's so easy for you. Why am I saying that? Because every generation has its unique challenges. Every generation has its unique challenges. Do not be presumptuous as you look at the younger generation and make these comparisons to what it was like in your life. Give patience and kindness and consideration. Spend time with them and get to know them and realize that their challenges are unique to their time. But especially express appreciation. If I were to present to you the numbers within these different demographics, one of the amazing blessings that we have at this church is that there is an equal proportion in all the age groups. I have friends whose churches, one of my friends is senior pastor, he's 37 years of age. All of his congregation is under the age of 35. When I started coming to this church, that's the way it was here. And as a result, we were very immature. But the blessing is there is a significant proportion of our church of individuals who have walked for decades with the Lord. But on the other side of that, I have friends whose churches are literally dying, that they're aging out. There isn't any young people coming to their church. It lacks vibrancy. It lacks vision. And in our church, we have both. We have all of those demographics, and it is a blessing for us. But what I want to say is, when I'm talking about the younger generation, if you were to compare my generation in this church and the younger generation per capita, there are more young people serving in the church than there are old people serving the church. They're in every sector of our church family. They're checking your kids in at 9:30 so that you can come and worship. They're here on Wednesday nights, taking one of their evenings, being in Awana, or Tuesday nights, ministering to the children. Every ministry that's going on has young adults, and they're giving of their time, and they're investing in the kingdom. Express gratitude to them. Acknowledge the sacrifices they're making. When we begin to do this, we begin to have healing from the wounds and the injuries because we're elevating respect. Here's the second thing that Paul's going to teach us. We're made whole by offering recognition. By offering recognition. Let me take you to verse 3. Notice the first thing he's going to say. Give proper recognition to those widows who are really in need. Paul is going to spend some time talking specifically about widows. We're going to address that in its context, but I'm going to, again, help us to see what it looks like in the larger context. When he says give proper recognition to those widows who are really in need, he's talking about widows that do not have family members. He's going to explain that as he gets to verse 5 and as he goes on deeper in this section. And these are folks that we actually have in our church. Perhaps their families have moved away or they don't have any children and they're all by themselves. And that's one of the factors that he's talking about is they don't have any relatives. But another thing you're going to see as we go deeper is that they practice the spiritual disciplines. They're looking to the Lord. They're devoted to Christ Jesus, and they're learning to trust God. But he says these individuals that we need to identify in our community deserve proper recognition. That means they need our help spiritually, emotionally, financially, physically. This is what he's going to say is true godliness as we take recognition and understand how we come alongside. Look as he's going to go in verse 5 and 6 to talk about widows who have family members. And he's going to address specifically the family members. As we pick up in those verses, he goes on to talk about if a widow has children, I'm in verse 4, if a widow has children or grandchildren, these should learn, first of all, to put their religion into practice by caring for their own family and so repaying their parents and grandparents, for this is pleasing to God. Let's unpack this for just a moment. This represents a lot of you. There are a number of you that have a grandparent, maybe even a parent that's living on their own. And Paul says, here's some specific things that you have a responsibility for. As he makes that statement, he says that you need to put your religion into practice. He's saying this is a sign of godliness. He's going to restate this at the end of it. If you truly want to be godly, he says it starts with your family. And you start caring especially for the widows or the widowers that are in need. Continuing on as he mentions the next thing. Caring for their own family and so repaying their parents and grandparents. It's a sign of gratitude. I want to make a mention before I go any further. I want to acknowledge that in the room and perhaps online that there are some of you that when we start talking about this, it brings up tremendous hurts and injuries. That you start thinking about your mom or your dad that was not there for you, that they failed you, or a grandparent that perhaps was abusive, and you have legitimate concerns. And as this passage is being unpacked, it's bringing back those memories. And when you start thinking about what Paul is saying is a responsibility, that seems like a wall that is impossible to get over. And I want to recognize that right now. But I want to share out of my own story without going into details and taking us off course, is that in my own household, my dad being a pastor, it was not uncommon on a Saturday to experience abuse and then sit and listen to him teach about the love of God on Sunday. I say that to honor my dad, but to speak boldly to this passage and its meaning. And that is that coming to realize that if I chose to follow God's instructions for me, that was the path of healing. Disregarding what God tells you to do will not bring about healing. And in God's mercy and his grace, in the last 10 years of my dad's life, there was healing. And by the time that he passed away with leukemia, I would consider him one of my closest friends. I acknowledge that that will not be the case for all of you. But I will declare, because God's nature says that he wants to bring about healing in your life. And whether that's feasible with your parents or not, God is your heavenly Father. And he wants to shift your view of how you see parents by shifting your view of him and his love for you. God is good all the time. And no matter what our hurts and injuries might be, that does not prohibit you from experiencing the fullness of life and starting anew in this generation. Coming back to the third thing that he talks about is that when you do this, it's pleasing to God. Even when it's hard, even when it's difficult, even when you don't think they deserve it, when you choose to do this, God is pleased and he's honored. So as we understand this and we see what's being said, go a little bit deeper with me. Let's look at verse 5. The widow who's really in need, he's going to come back to the widow that doesn't have any family. The widow who is really in need and left alone puts her hope in God and continues night and day to pray and to ask God for help. What's happening in the text is that he comes back to this idea that they don't have any family. The church is it. But he uses the Greek perfect tense, the verb perfect tense, which means that she has for a long time put her hope in God and continues to trust the Lord for his provision. It's important that we understand what was happening culturally. It was common for a husband in his 30s or early 40s to die. It was uncommon for a woman to have a career and have a means of finance, which means when her husband was ill and it was imperative that something was going to happen, that he was going to pass away, that woman made the choice to trust God, look at the future and say, even though there's no life insurance policy, there's no means for employment, I have a God who's demonstrated that he cares for me and he loves me. And he's saying the church needs to recognize that and come alongside. And one of the things he adds, the third thing he adds, is that this woman has been in continual prayer. That's an aspect of spiritual discipline that she practices. What's so powerful about that is that's another transcendent principle to all of us. Too many times we look at prayer as being passive, but scripture teaches that prayer is the most active thing that you can do as a believer. Because when you practice prayer like these widows and you have that discipline, your hope is elevated that your God is looking out for you, that he's actually in control and you're attentive to his work. So even when you don't see it, you haven't lost faith or hope because you know it's present and it's there. That's how he's describing these amazing godly women. An internal kingdom value is intrinsic. What he's talking about is that kingdom values are not always on the outside. They're not always extrinsic. They're intrinsic. It comes from a conviction that the Spirit puts in your soul and you live that out. So how do we go about doing this? What does this actually look like? Let me give you an illustration and bring it to some of the practical parts. This sponge I purchased 5 years ago. And almost on a weekly basis, I've used it to wash the vehicles at our house. It's clearly well worn, but it's been a great one. It has this mesh on the side that helps try and get the road tar off the side of the car, but then it has this soft part for the high gloss areas. But after 5 years, it's seen its better days. And after I finish the 11 o'clock service, the last thing I'm going to do is drop it in the trash as I go out. It has no further use. Now, I know that if you're here at the 11 o'clock service, there's not a single person that's going to follow me out and pull this out of the trash can. You all agree that this is ready to be finished with. It's time to dispose it. As I make that statement, it's tragic that the same thing is true within our society when it comes to aging people. You say, well, that's kind of presumptuous, Bruce, for you to say that. Let me share out of a personal experience to bring some action. My mom, you've heard me tell you this before, taught public school till she was 79 and was diagnosed with breast cancer. At the age of 79, she moved in full-time with my brother and his wife. She lived with them for 10 years. My brother and his wife were so gracious. They opened up their home, made a special apartment as a part of their house. And she lived there until she began to develop dementia. And when she was 89 and a half, she had a stroke and the baseline of dementia went to another level. So right before 2016, New Year's Eve of 2016, the doctors had already told my brother and I that she wasn't going to get better, that it was actually dangerous for her to be living in that apartment in their house. And they said, you're going to have to put her in a memory care. And I remember it like it was yesterday. On New Year's Eve, we moved my mom in, and I remember her look on her face as if to say, why am I here? And when I got back into my brother's car, I began to weep about that decision. My heart was broken. What was insightful to me is in the coming weeks and months, as my brother and I would visit my mom in this memory care facility, is that there were numerous people there where their families never came to see them, ever. And we would receive comments constantly by the caregivers about my brother and I being there and being frequent, to the point where they would invite us to spend time with some of the other residents to pray over them and care for them. That is a picture of our society. That they look at people that are aging because they value productivity. And if someone's not being productive enough, if they're not contributing enough to society, then they're no longer seen as valuable. And that should never be the case with the church. In God's economy, every single person matters. They have value, and therefore they deserve our respect. So practically, how we go about doing that. I'm going to give two different categories now as I move forward. One of older adults and aging adults represent those that are over 80. So older adults represent those in their late 50s and those in their 60s. Here's the way that we can go about treating them, and that's recognizing that older adults need to have a connection. We need to remain connected and offer consideration. The age group that I see here that this represents is the largest age group in this service. And that is that you have parents that are in their late 50s, going into their 60s, maybe their early 70s. And many of you have grandparents that age. And I want to say to you that I understand that you're busy, that you have full lives. You're raising kids, you have a job, you have all this different responsibility. And you look at your parents and they appear that they have it together. They may still be working, they have a home, they're traveling. And the assumption is that they're completely fine. But the fact of the matter is that as they enter their 60s, they are recognizing that whatever they're doing at the end of their 60s is not what they're doing when they start. Their lives are changing. And what they long most for is to be connected. And I'm sharing that with you because if you don't make a practice now and learn to be disciplined to reach out to them, that you will miss that. Now they're going to be in their late 70s, they're going to be declining. And one of the struggles that some of you are already beginning to experience is that when you go home or you reach out to your parents, you're seeing that they're changing. You're noticing physically they don't have the same strength, they don't have the same vitality. And it's hard for you to recognize and accept that they're not the heroes that you once had. You're beginning to accept the fact that you're going to have more of a participation in their care. If you wait till they reach that point where they're in ultimate decay, it's going to be even more painful. But if you make the choice now to invest in their lives and stay connected, healing can begin and you'll be better prepared for when that season happens. The second part that I reference in there is offer consideration, revisiting the fact that their lives are changing. One of the things that they're beginning to wonder is, what is their purpose? They've raised you as children. They've accomplished that task. In most cases that you're here, they've helped you to love Jesus and follow Christ. They've helped you get an education. You're often on your own. Some of you are raising your own kids. And as they look at their own lives, they're questioning, what is my purpose? I've completed that task. And part of your role is to helping them to see that they still have a purpose in your life. It's not like it used to be, but there is something significant that you can help them realize that they're bringing to the table. Going back to what I talked about earlier, some of that is just giving them the space to tell stories and share, if you have children, with them about what their life was like when they were younger. They need to feel useful. That's one of the things they're struggling with. Now, coming back to the aging population, this is what we need to do in recognizing adults that are aging. We need to communicate their value and cultivate their dignity. In the same way, as a person reaches their late 70s and they get into their early 80s, they have been told their whole life that their value is producing. It's raising their kids, it's going to work, it's having employment. And now all of a sudden, they're in a spot where they can't do any of those things. They struggle to go for a walk. They're finding it difficult to accomplish anything. And what you and I need to understand is we need to appreciate and understand that, and we need to continue to communicate their value. Go back to the idea, if they're people of faith, go back to the fact that they have followed God. They weren't perfect, but they have trusted God. If they helped you with your education, going back to what Paul has already said, is communicate the value that they've supported you and they've walked with you. They've given you these opportunities. Don't fail to express that to them. But especially as they reach that older age, help them to realize that they still are important. They're a part of God's kingdom. They are children of God, as we've stated already. But here's the thing that I believe is most important, and that is cultivate their dignity. Can I repeat that? Cultivate their dignity. Pretty soon, their hearings start to fail. They're having a difficult time seeing. And whether they recognize it or not, as they enter into that place, one of their great fears is they're going to lose their dignity. As they age and they can't do the same things, that people are looking at them and they're wondering, what in the world are they still here for? And we need to help them to see that God, as their Lord, has got them, and that we need to respect them and show them dignity in those places of weakness and decline. And when we do that, we are actually partnering with God and witnessing his hand in their lives. They are here, my young friends, for a purpose. They're not just here because they'll tell you that. I've had so many friends that have reached their late 80s, and when I start the conversation, well, how are you doing? Well, I'm still here. I told God I'm ready to go home, and I said, why aren't you taking me? But I'm still here. And we can laugh and joke about that, and they may be saying that tongue in cheek, but the fact of the matter is they literally feel that way. So listen, respond, but speak into that. Speak about your own value and appreciation of their existence. And then invite them to pray for you. Bring them back to this part of this text that says, prayer matters. You still can pray over me and my family. And watch how life begins to be rejuvenated. So what's the big idea, the take-home truth for this? We are ultimately made whole by offering resources. Let me show you in verses 7 and 8. First reading, verse 7. Give the people these instructions so that no one may be open to blame. What Paul was telling Timothy is that there are some that are ignorant about this because the culture doesn't teach this. The culture doesn't explain it. And as I have been going over this text throughout the week and realizing that that's my responsibility, I want you to know that this is what God expects of us. I don't want any of you to face God someday and realize that you fail to care and show respect to the people around you in a very specific and practical way and have him say, you missed it. So we stop and we look at this passage and say, what does it mean to us? How do we live it out? And here's the reason, the justification of why this is so important. If you look at verse 8, Paul finishes with this emphatic statement, if anyone does not provide for their relatives, especially for their own household, they have denied the faith and is worse than an unbeliever. Paul's saying that God looks at this idea of how we bring him pleasure by taking this seriously and looking at how we can go about accomplishing that individually and collectively. As I share that, I want to close with having you read a passage with me that summarizes what Paul has said and give you an action. Would you do that as James comes on the screen? Let's say it together. Religion that God our Father accepts as pure and faultless is this: to look after orphans and widows in their distress, and to keep oneself from being polluted by the world. God says, if you really want to be godly, you want to know what's important to me, this is where you begin. So the action that comes on the screen is that I want us to provide a tangible blessing to a believer in need, whether they are young or old. Pray, ask God to reveal to you, alert you who you can reach out and show some aspect of God's tangible love, to love your neighbor. But I want to go one step further as you write that down. In the last couple of weeks, Monica and I have been praying because of a growing populace of widows and widowers in our church. And we began to ask, what can we do to help and come alongside? If God is stirring your heart today and you're thinking about those individuals, and you have a little time that you'd love to commit to that, then write your name on a Connect card and let us know. If you have the gift of helps and you like to bake, we're talking about just dropping cookies off or baked goods off. If you have a passion for prayer, let us know and we can help you know how to pray for them. If you have the gift of hospitality and would love actually making a phone call or going to visit them, we would implore you to do the same thing. But there is a growing need. And if you're willing to give a little bit of time, perhaps a couple hours a month, we want to mobilize to move forward in practical ways and care for these dear and wonderful folks in our midst. Would you please pray with me? Heavenly Father, for many of us, there are individuals that come to our mind as we think about an aging populace, whether they be widows or family members or grandparents. And we love them, but it seems that quite often that we're so busy, preoccupied, that we fail to pause and think about their presence. I also realize that for many who have so much on their plate, it just feels like another task. And so I ask that you would help them begin, as you bring that individual or individuals to mind, by stopping in that moment and praying for them. Praying over the very things that we talked about, perhaps a fear of losing their dignity or a fear of not being noticed or being invisible, and that we would gather in your spirit to elevate respect both for those that are aging and those that are younger. And that as a result, we would experience healing and there would be a greater sense of family for us, both in our immediate family, but in our church family. And as this goes forward, I pray that you would be honored and glorified, knowing that you've already said that when we do this, you are pleased. So it's for your great name, Jesus, that I pray. Amen.